Welcome to Random Stuff About Watches. This is a series where I do a deep dive into, well, random stuff about watches so that you can tell your friends and they can be impressed about how much random stuff you know about watches. Here we go, episode 1. Today we are talking about the Timex Q, but not the re-releases that came out a few years ago, the original Timex Qs that came out in the 1970s. I just learned something very interesting that I didn't know before, which was that even though it has Q in the name, and even though they were marketed as quartz watches, they actually weren't quartz watches. Well, not entirely. They were like kind of part mechanical watches, part quartz, part mini computer. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, what? Mini computer? Yeah, you'll understand more by the time this is over. So the original Q models can be seen in 1972, and this was Timex's response to the quartz crisis that was going on at the time. So to put into context the creation of the Timex Q line, we have to dive in to the quartz crisis. Okay, and if you're like me and you haven't really looked into the quartz crisis, then maybe through like some word of mouth or some videos that you have seen in the past, well then you might just assume that Seiko invented quartz watches completely from scratch, all by their lonesome. One day Seiko just dropped out of the big blue sky and invented quartz watches. Well, not exactly. Quartz watches had already been invented and used in large clocks since the late 1920s. Let me just look at my notes here. It says, invented by Warren Morrison and Joseph W. Horton at Bell Telephone Laboratories in 1927. So why is it then that most people credit Seiko with inventing the quartz watch or starting the quartz crisis when quartz had already been invented for some time? Well, the thing is that the technology that had been invented was mostly used to power large clocks, like grandfather clocks, and the technology took up quite a large space. But it was actually Seiko that managed to engineer a miniature version of that system. And then they applied it to the very first quartz wristwatch, which in the watch world, being first at anything, that's a big deal. And thus, the Seiko Quartz Astron was released in 1969 commercially as the first quartz wristwatch, which had an accuracy rate of plus or minus 5 seconds per month. And that was light years ahead of whatever Swiss watch company could produce with its mechanical models at that time. And you have to think, Seiko didn't just give away their quartz technology. It was a closely guarded secret, and that's what contributed to Seiko's dominance in the early days of quartz. And really that was in part to Seiko's design of the stepping motor, which is a key component in quartz watches, and even still to this day, it is a key component in quartz watches. This is the component of the quartz watches that's responsible for the precise movement of the hands, and also regulates some of the power consumption within the watch. This was an engineering feat by Seiko, and eventually other watchmakers, they made their own stepping motor designs, or they just got licenses from Seiko. It's just kind of crazy to think that a quartz watch was a high-tech, groundbreaking innovation. And just to give you some perspective, the Seiko Astron was released in 1969 for a total of 450,000 yen. Translated today, that's approximately 1.6 million yen, which converted to US dollars is about $15,000. So more or less, this price tag was the equivalent of purchasing a new car at the time. So yeah, good luck convincing your wife on that one. Hey guys, maybe we should also credit Seiko with causing the ask your wife crisis. Am I right? Anybody? Come on. Okay, anyway, so what does this have to do with the Timex Q? Well, quartz technology was still so new. Major Swiss brands were just trying to develop their own technology to compete. And you can see this with the birth of the electric watch. If you don't know about electrical watches, they were kind of like a hybrid using electrical components, resistors, and mechanical parts. And yes, they were battery powered. And like many of those companies, Timex was actually already making electrical watches by that time. they were using their M40 movement. And again, just to oversimplify the differences here, whereas a mechanical watch uses a wound-up spring to power up the moving components, the Timex M40 movement used a battery cell to provide a current through contact of the balance wheel, which magnetized the hairspring, making the movement tick. And as I was doing research on electrical watches and the M40 movement in particular, I came across a YouTube channel, Chris's Ticks. So he actually owns and repairs some of these watches and provides a lot of pretty cool content as to how they work. If you're interested in learning more about the M40 movement, I'll link his channel and you can check him out. Okay, so Timex, like everyone else, was looking to be successful in the quartz market. I mean, it was literally either that or go out of business. After the commercial release of the first quartz watch by Seiko, it only took 10 years for 60% of the Swiss watch-making companies to go out of business. That's the quartz crisis, baby. By the time 1972 rolls along, quartz watches were becoming the new trendy thing in the watch world. 1972 was definitely a big year for quartz watches. Many different watch manufacturers were now producing them. The thing is that they still remained a highly expensive item. And it is at this time where Timex, as a watch company, they just show their marketing genius. And in 1972, Timex does what is, in my opinion, one of the singular most important moves as a company, possibly even solidifying it as one of the most notorious watch brands of all time, and that is the release of the Timex Q line. Since traditional quartz parts were still expensive and Timex didn't have their own stepping rotor design, they did the next best thing. They took their M40 movement, balance wheel, and everything, and they just slapped a tiny quartz controlled circuit board on the side. Literally, it was the M40 movement, same exact parts and everything, just right on top, boom, circuit board. It was essentially a modified mechanical watch with quartz components inside, but this was still good enough for Timex to market it as a quartz watch. A year later, they refined the movement a little bit and came out with the M63 movement. But to be honest, the changes were really minimal. I think they just kind of cleaned it up a little bit. The watch was still mostly mechanical moving parts. Even the second-hand sweep at 21,600 beats per hour. It had an accuracy of plus or minus 15 seconds a month, and they could even be regulated, according to Timex. So this was definitely not your average quartz, not as how we know quartz today, but this was a different beast altogether. Timex marketed this watch as quartz with the prominent Q above the Timex, and then there's the quartz right above the 6 o'clock. I mean, they milked it, right? Like, truly, this was a brilliant move by Timex. The original Timex Q would become the world's most affordable quartz watch. And that statement is a little hard to fact check 100%, but if you're looking at all the major brands that were producing quartz watches at the time, like Omega, Rolex, Hamilton, it's pretty safe to assume that Timex made quartz watches affordable. They were pretty loud about the Q line too. They marketed this as affordable new age tech. And when you look at some of their ads, they're boasting about space age technology, using words like microcomputer electronics. While other watch companies met their doom at the quartz crisis, Timex capitalized on the trend and achieved remarkable success. So some would just say this is a rumor, and others might say it's more of an educated guess, but estimates show that at one point, Timex sold roughly 1 out of every 3 watches globally. Think about that. Okay, so what happened to all the Qs? Well, as time passed and quartz technology and watches became more sophisticated and readily available, naturally the Timex Q line just started to fade away. But also this was in part to the new digital watch craze that took over the 80s and the late 90s, and by that time Timex had already moved on to new projects like the Ironman or the Marathon. That's a whole video altogether. The point is that the Q line's importance in Timex history, or really quartz history as a whole, it can't be understated. When we think about the Timex Q now, I mean, coming off of the heels of a global pandemic and a resurgence of appreciation for timepieces and horology, Timex once again re-released the 1979 Q line. Initially with one of its more popular models bearing the semblance to the Rolex GMT Pepsi colors, and it is as if history repeated itself one more time. Once again, Timex Q stole the spotlight. Everyone was talking about that watch at some point, and it was really a pure reissue, even down to the not so great arm pulling band, its coin slot battery hatch. The biggest difference between the original Qs and the reissue was the movement, with the reissue now ironically sporting a quartz movement from Seiko, the Seiko S2 Epson. Perhaps this was the movement that Timex had dreamed of initially when they invented the Q line. It's kind of poetic actually when you think about it. So since its reissue, Timex has produced several different variants of this Timex Q in different colors, and even Timex Q inspired models such as the chronograph or the GMT variant, all which have been successful. So that pretty much wraps up this video, and I'm curious to think, what's your opinion of the Timex Q line? Did you like it? Did you own one? Or if you didn't own one, why didn't you own one? What's your opinion about Timex as a watch company and its contribution to the quartz? In my opinion, we credit Seiko with inventing quartz, but I believe that Timex opened the door for quartz to be available to the everyman. Would quartz be what it is today if it was not for Timex? Who knows? So I hope you had enjoyed this episode of Random Stuff About Watches, and if you want to know more random stuff about watches, go ahead and give it a like and subscribe. It actually helps the algorithm so that you don't miss another episode of Random Stuff About Watches. And you can add all this knowledge to your repertoire of watch collecting and interesting watch conversations with your friends. Or like most of us who don't have any friends, you can just watch this in the background while you quote unquote work from home. So thanks everyone, and until next time, bye.